My thanks to Andrea and to Ruben for including me in this, what's been a really fascinating conference so far. I'm happy for the opportunity of this conference to think through what are some starting thoughts on the sort of ecology of Etruscan urbanization. And as Marion's intro will suggest, I came to this working backwards from the Roman period, looking for continuities between what will be sort of early Iron Age Italy and the early Roman period, failing to find them and trying in some sense to explain them. My basic motivation in this paper is to set together major recent advances in the archaeology of early urban society in Etruria and in the paleoclimatology of the same region. The topic of urbanization in central Mediterranean Italy has received increasing and I think increasingly sophisticated attention, deservedly so. It's gone from a sort of marginal topic in thinking about Mediterranean urbanization to a sort of paradigmatic case of polyogenesis. Etruria was, depending on what counts as a city and when you date it, among the earliest urbanized regions of the Mediterranean and shows some particular and I think very interesting characteristics. That said, there's been little attempt in this discussion so far to discuss these early urban communities from an ecological or environmental perspective. I think this is surprising. It's surprising, first of all, because urbanization in Etruria can be seen as fundamentally tied to the environment and fundamentally ecological for a few reasons. First, the reputation of the Etruscans as keen observers of natural phenomena. This finds confirmation in numerous documents. We've talked about the bronchoscopic calendar. I showed the Piacenza liver, the calendar of the Capua tile up here. These are all late documents, but they show a very deep interest in seasonality and climate. And I think we're permitted to take them as part of a fairly long-standing interest in landscape and in reading that landscape. Second, in broad terms, aggregated settlement or the increase of aggregated settlement everywhere depends on demographic expansion and increased economic output. And these factors are directly influenced, particularly in the pre-modern world, by meteorological inputs. To feed more people, you need to raise marginal production, and one clear path to doing this is by adapting to the unpredictable and risk-laden Mediterranean cycle of good and bad years. Resource management was therefore vital to Etruscan success, and indeed many of the early and largest Etruscan cities, urban sites, Caere, Tarquinia, Veii, Volci, are consistently placed inland on rivers where they had good access to arable land and could engage in trade. Third, the story of early Etruria's urbanization is also a story of rising social complexity and inequality. In most cases in Etruria, the emergence of cities meant the emergence of elites, who distinguished themselves by somehow gaining restricted access to land. In anthropological theory, we can think about the so-called Sachs-Goldstein hypothesis, which draws attention to how burial areas tend to be located around the edges of settlement to mark claims to territory. This is certainly something we see in all the early Etruscan urban sites. There's also possible very early written confirmation of an interest in property rights and overlap with elite identity in Etruria with the Triatella Sippus, a 7th century document which may contain reference to elite enclosure of sacred or private land. So with these things in mind, what I want to do in this talk is take us through some of the evidence for what an ecology, in this case in particular, a climate history of this region would look like from the 10th to the 6th century BCE, and juxtapose that with what we now know about the rise of urban communities in the region at the same time. I'm just showing the region that interests me the most. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the southern part of Etruria, where we have very good archaeological data from early urban sites, settlement areas. I'm also going to discuss Populonia a little more to the north here, right here. So I'm going to be focusing in this area here, just north of the Tiber, in Veii, Tarquinia, and then I'm also going to go to Populonia, where again the data is very good for this early urbanization process. I'm going to discuss some coincidences, I think, in the timing of this process that suggest societal responses to climate. And then I'll close with some thoughts on how Etruria's early urban communities developed strategies of resilience and adaptation, and how this may have fed into their long-run success or ultimately failure. Okay, so let's start with climate. I'm going to assume that this crowd at this point has a very good sense of how we reconstruct climate from scientific archives. So I'm going to skip mostly to the data here. I note before I do so that for Italy in this period, our proxies do look somewhat different than for other parts of the Mediterranean. We have no continuous dendro record, no tree ring record. That leaves us a little wobbly with dates. for this period. We don't have good ice. There's no good alpine ice for this period reaching back to the Iron Age. Instead, we have primarily two sources of paleoenvironmental information. We have pollen and we have speleothems, or speleothems and other sort of varved deposits that can be studied isotopically. We've already seen a little bit about the oxygen 18 isotope that's shown to be a good record of largely insensitive to human impact, and therefore a good record of winter precipitation in speleothems and summer conditions in lacustrine deposits. And the other thing that's quite important about this data is that it relies on uranium-thorium dating and sort of avoids issues. We haven't even brought up the Hallstatt plateau here, but it avoids issues at the Hallstatt plateau and with the fact that much of what we want when we talk about the first millennium BC Mediterranean, much of what we want is in a period where we cannot do radiocarbon dates very easily. So speleothems help us avoid that. A second very abundant source of information, as I noted, is pollen, but I'm going to skip pollen entirely for this period. Pollen is notoriously difficult in terms of differentiating between anthropic and climatic drivers or signals. In particular, in the late Holocene, there's a great deal of debate about this, but I think we can do things without pollen here. We also know that Etruscans are modifying forest cover from a very early period. We have some very interesting charcoal information from orientalizing blast furnaces from Thessalonica, which shows that they're going after particular species of trees. So Etruscans are intervening in forest cover so early that I think the issues of going from pollen to climate without thinking of human intervention are too problematic. What I want to try to do in that case is go from global indices, which are generally better resolved, to the local indices and try to tie these two things together. The starting point for me doing so is a grand solar minimum, or a low in solar energy, sort of smack dab in the middle of the period we're interested in. This is the so-called Homeric or Hallstatt minimum here. And you see it very clearly identified on the upper graph here. This is this drop in TSI, in total solar irradiance. And the good thing about this is because it depends on a sort of multi-proxy analysis, the dates are quite good. And we could say that from about 810 to 650, on a global scale, we have somewhat cooler temperature. Now, what's interesting about Italy is that there's a demonstrated link in the scientific literature between TSI and the NAO, in the North Atlantic Oscillation. And so this is an oceanic effect that has a seesawing effect on precipitation. And what tends to happen is when it's in a negative phase, it draws storms westward, and it tends to make the upper left corner of the Mediterranean wetter. And this includes Italy. So Italy, Spain, I'll talk about Majorca, some of the Balearics, and the Gallic coast right here become wetter during periods of grand solar minimum. These are all, of course, trends that happen on very extensive both geographic and temporal scales. But that is a unique thing to the region. It's both global, but because of the link between TSI and NAO, it does mean that, in particular, Italy should be, again, on grand scales, cooler and wetter at the same time. Whereas I think it was quite good to have Anton's talk earlier. This has a seesaw effect on the Mediterranean. So at the same time, the Eastern Mediterranean can be drier at the same time. But the link between NAO and TSI is for me, important here. All right, so what we want to do is we want to knit this together with much more sort of local indices. And again, here, I think the best thing to look at are the speleothems. So I put up a number of, and as I said, this is really recent stuff. So most of these publications are within the last 3 or 4 years, if that. And some of this work will be coming out soon. So, what do we see? Well, I'm going to start on the left-hand side, a little off of the trending area, and then by the time I get to the right-hand side of the chart, we'll be much closer to the area of Etruria that I'm interested in. In a newly studied multi-record analysis from Majorca, there's an age depth to the speleothem of 2,800 years BP, and indeed at the very base of the core, so here we're talking about 800 to 700 BC, thereabouts, we see a drying trend. So it is matching, in this case, our global TSI-NAO effects here. It's helpfully matching the NAO phase. From Lago di Pergusa in Sicily here, you see this arrow here, that's what interests me. We have, again, this sort of drop here, but here a somewhat more advanced period in time from about 750 to 400 in Sicily. We have a drop in summer precipitation here, a drying trend here, a little more advanced. From Tyrrhenian Italy itself, so now moving to Italy here, and I'm sorry for the out of order slides here. We're on the edges of the Alpine area right here, and then I have two more speleothems. They're not there. They're the yellow dots right there, the Cortia Cave and the Ranella Cave. This is Rio Martino, which is right here. So these three speleothems from Italy here. What do we get? Again, we have this sort of prolonged period of humidity in between two more intense periods of aridification. The dry episodes, in particular Cortia and Ranella, so here right on the northern border of Etruria, are about 950 and 750 BC, and then again at 550 BC. It is somewhat more advanced in the Rio Martino speleothem, but again, what we have is, in essence, the pattern that we see in the NAO, in the TSI data, being now brought to Italy here. So some sort of ground truthing of it as far as we want. One thing that you have to know here is these speleothems are dated these on discrete samples here. The uranium thorium dating that you take a small sample, it's not continuous dating. So the time windows in which we operate here are quite large. They can often be century-wide time levels. So if we do, in effect, if we do a sort of wiggle match here to put these trends together, we see this downward trend happening from humidity to aridification at some point across Italy and the Western Mediterranean in the mid-8th to 7th centuries BC. So we do have some, in essence, local data to support these global effects. At longer temporal scales, then, Etruria is probably overall wetter and cooler from the 9th to the 7th century, and then the ensuing Archaic period, the 6th and 5th century, trends the other way, but is also otherwise less stable or consistent over the region. And again, it matches Anton's stuff to the Archaic period being somewhat more unstable in terms of humidity and precipitation. Okay, so what about urbanization? Current thinking on the urbanization process in Etruria grows out of the analysis of landscape archaeology and now benefits from several very recent excavations of sites dating to the very beginnings of this process. We see continuity in major urban sites from the final Bronze Age onward, 10th century onward, to the early Iron Age. Around that same moment, in the 10th and really into the 9th century, a number of smaller final Bronze Age sites, especially those in lower lying positions, go out, and population seems to concentrate on these already occupied plateaus, which would go on to become cities. The process of wealth accumulation and social stratification is recognized in impressive early Iron Age burials from Veii, Tarquinia, Caere, Volci, and elsewhere. At some sites, structures understood as civic or political suggest new forms of intra-community interaction. Critical material in this regard now comes from three sites. First, Tarquinia and the Pian di Civita, where continuous cult activity in a natural cavity in the bedrock starts in the 10th century and is complemented by wooden hut architecture from the 8th century onward. There's the so-called edificio beta. By the early 8th century, a ritual burial, possibly sacrifice or otherwise a transgressive individual, suggests collective practices verging at that point onto law or similar community-based practices. Second is Veii and the Piazza d'Armi, and this is the exhibition at the University of Rome, where we also find exceptional burial, this time from the 9th century on the plateau, in what would go on to become a node of walled settlement. A small shrine is built around another burial by the 8th century. And then third, at Papillonia, this is obviously a reconstructed Iron Age hut here, not a remarkably well-preserved hut. At Papillonia, where we have a very early polyogenesis process from the 9th century. We have monumental tomb architecture, the earliest in Etruria. We now can join this. These are these tombs that ring or are situated in the beach beneath an acropolis. And on the top of the acropolis, we now have this 9th century hut. So we now have this sort of major elite settlement on top as well. All of these sites, as with others in Etruria, undergo radical transformation in the 7th and 6th centuries. But the most important thing to emphasize for me right now is the continuous occupation, and it would appear the continuous use of space, especially at Tarquinia and Veii, where early activity was commemorated within later urban fabric. So what we get in later periods now, that is in the Orientalizing period, the Archaic period, these aren't new cities, but rather new or different phases or uses of space and new phases of continuous life or settlement life. As I've been hinting at, these processes are pretty clearly related to demographic increase, and from that, I think, to resource use and environmental drivers. Notably, urbanization in Etruria begins, now if we try to sync this with our climate data, more or less at the start of the Homeric grand solar minimum of a period of weather. And again, overall and on longer timescales, the speleothems do suggest local variability, but they also suggest that this early paleogenesis process happens between phases of dryness during a period of humidity. At the same time, the monumentalization of some of these sites, the orientalizing period, the archaic period, happens after that phase ends, during a period of greater climate instability and probably greater aridity. That is, the demographic increase that supported the final Bronze Age to early Iron Age transition may have happened in the period of comparatively more precipitation and stability, while the intensive investments in technological innovations of archaic cities in Etruria happened during a period of, again, on longer scales, scarcity and unpredictability. This is obviously a very broad brush picture, but I think it does merit emphasis. About a decade ago, in really one of the only works to try and think about this process in ecological terms, Jean Turfa's book on the bryoscopic calendar, she suggested that Etruscan society emerges in a period of what she called ominous and comparatively unpredictable climate. At that point, I think on the data that I'm bringing forward here, on the newer data, we can in fact controvert this view. If anything, Etruscan urban society emerges in a period of less ominous climate, while instability and deterioration characterize the subsequent period. And if this is our broad brush framework, what can we say about the actual level of urban communities? To answer this question, I want to turn now to the topic of resource management, and I want to focus in particular on how these communities are adapting to favorable or less favorable conditions in terms of their supplies of water and their supplies of food, food as a proxy to agricultural yields. Okay, starting with water. So those of you who know the literature will know that Etruscans are famous for a positive reputation for hydraulic engineering. There's been a whole slew of conference volumes on the Etrusci Maestri Hydrology here. But what I want to stress is that I went through all of this, or I hope I did, because I'm not going to argue a negative here. But there's remarkably little hydraulic infrastructure attached to these early urban communities. There's enormous, amazing stuff. You go to Perugia, this is the Sorbello well, 440 kiloliters of water, and this thing is enormous. It's a 3rd century BC well, right? And that goes with much of the material we have here. Most of this sort of large-scale monumental hydraulic works that we associate with these early urban communities in Etruria is in fact later. It's from the Archaic period. It's from periods after that. I'll talk a little bit about what we have in a second. I think that's quite important because for most of these sites, right, the paleogenesis process involved moving upward, moving away from low-lying water sources. In all of the sort of major urban sites, we do have springs, but we have them right outside the walls, right? Getting water to people living on these plateaus was a challenge, and there's very little record of that as far as it goes. What can we say? We can look at a site like Veii, which has been very well studied for its hydraulic infrastructure. We can find cisterns, we can find wells, but they tend to date from 600 BC onward. They're not earlier. We have the same situation at Tarquinia. We have wells, we have cisterns, we have channels near Edificio Beta. There's two major cisterns, one circular, one rectangular. If you want to talk about the shape of them, we could do that later. But the point is they're late. They're 6th century and they're onward. Again, at Orvieto, at Orte, we have these major systems of caniculi underneath the street plan with things like this, but these are 6th, 5th century innovations. There's very little going backwards as far as it goes. I should say the same chronology also describes the famous caniculi which filled the territory of South Etruria that were first observed by Ward Perkins, first studied by Ward Perkins, and are a real sort of key point of hydraulic engineering for Etruscans. These are notoriously difficult to date, but in the very few places where we can date these channels, we find that they tend to date later. So one example is this is the Ponte Soto at Veii. The Ponte Soto cuts, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a caniculus up there, and so the caniculus it's thought to be of the 6th century. It's very hard to put these things back before that. So again, we have a sort of similar chronology. We can discuss this more. It's very interesting because these irrigation channels, in some sense, are a different response than a well or a cistern. Right? Wells or cisterns are for are for a scarcity of water in an urban area. Some of these drainage systems are for an overabundance of water in a sort of agricultural area, but that's another topic. Okay, so in some deliberate water management in these areas that go on to these cities and territories is often significant, but it's also significantly later than the early phases of settlement. So one obvious question here is this simply a matter of visibility? We're talking about hut architecture. It is, of course, possible that we simply don't have signs that are archaeologically legible of the infrastructure of these sites. I don't think we're going to argue this is not the case. I'm going to do so because we do have sites in particular, either rural sites or sites that are persistently rural, or sites often in the Po Valley, where we do have water infrastructure. We have signs of it, but these date to the 9th century, so they're quite early, but we don't have the same thing from the urban areas. We have sites like this is Campesini near Monteriggioni. It's a hut settlement with just a couple burials, a very small settlement, but has a fairly complex system of basins and chambers, probably to support artisanal activity on site. Here's some not drinking water, which is interesting in itself. Here we have at Verrucchio, so again, this very early urban settlement, but north of the Apennines on the Adriatic coast here, or inland from the Adriatic coast, we have these water channels that belong to the earliest moment of settlement, 9th century again, so contemporary to the very early moments of settlement at Tarquinia, at Veii, at Populonia here, but we don't find these sorts of things back in the Tyrrhenian area. Okay, so my argument is a negative argument, but it's as strong as I can make it here. Let's see what food supply looks like. Here, I think we see a similar trajectory of late investment in resilience. Is that right? Yeah, okay, a little out of it, that's okay. I start by confessing my ignorance once again. I do not know a single example of large-scale food storage associated with an early phase of Etruscan settlement. I simply don't know it. I know from the bioarchaeological evidence that we'll hear about that Etruscans are certainly modifying crops, various things like that, livestock, but in terms of storage facilities and resilience, there's very little there. There's a beehive cistern on Populonia next to that hut, which is of a late 7th century date, which has been suggested to be a silo. That's literally all I know of. And once again, right, we do have signs of what storage infrastructure looks like from other settlements of the state. So again, if you cross into the Po Valley here, here at Oppiano here, you have these cellars built beside huts, going back very early, 9th century here. It would have been very easy to make these in the sort of Tufo plateaus, but we do not have them from the Tyrrhenian area. Instead, what we do have is a suggestion of a continuity of household practices. But Phil Perkins has written a very interesting paper recently looking at pithoi, and his suggestion is that the use of these large ceramic storage jars in sort of late Bronze Age Italy continues to become a real point of practice in Etruscan cities. Of the, his earliest examples are from the 9th century, but of the sort of 7th and 6th century. He surveyed 3,000 examples of this sort. This is a small-scale practice that can be scaled up. It's ultimately a household practice. And I think finding these things across all of our urban sites can help us make an argument that resilience of food supply within these early communities may be largely continuous with preceding household practices. We do start to see some more investment in food storage, and interestingly enough, not in later urban sites. I still don't know of a single magazine or warehouse or grain storage from one of these early Etruscan cities, but we do see them in their hinterlands. In this aspect, Etruria's history of food storage differs from its history of hydraulic infrastructure. The earliest functionally specific storage architecture in Etruria that I know of appears in the 7th and 6th century. So we see it, for example, at Merlo, the so-called North Building at Merlo, whose foundation date is in the 7th century here, seems to be a storage building, an outbuilding that's a storage building, but Merlo is decidedly not an urban settlement. What it is an open debate, but it's not an urban settlement here. We also have this recently discovered structures. Again, this is a restoration here by Andrea Zittorero here, called the Casa delle Amphore, in the hinterland of Marsiliana d'Albania, where it was found. You can see it here pretty clearly, just completely chock full of amphorae. here, so the house of the Emperor here, it seems to be a storage building associated with agricultural production. Again, the date is later in our urbanization process, and again, not in an urban center, 625 to 575. The date accords pretty well with our first series of P amphorae. So here's one here, the earliest transport amphorae coming from Etruria, and these two can be taken as a sort of proxy for rising production, for trade, for that sort of intensification of Etruscan foodways. But once more, we don't see that until a later period. So, in very broad terms, this is what I'd like to suggest. We have, in essence, two phases of urbanization and climate response in Etruria. First, we have a phase from about 800 to 650. The dates are sort of wiggly depending where we are, where we see demographic growth, we see movement to central upland sites, and a first stage of urbanization. But we see no evidence for concomitant strategies or infrastructure on the part of these early communities to make them resilient to environmental unpredictability. This stage overlaps roughly with the Homeric solar maximum and macro-regionally wetter weather. Second, from about 650 down to 500 or so, we start to see more visible and monumental forms of infrastructure, primarily in terms of hydraulic works at urban sites, and we see very little in terms of food storage. It's tempting to see this development as to some degree shaped by climate. Communities arose when it was to some extent easier to support them. Then, as demography continued to increase, environmental conditions began to deteriorate, communities adapted. I caution that I hardly think climate explains the whole story, but it does add an interesting element in an increasingly complex narrative that seems increasingly to depend on community-based agency. A generation or two ago, we'd attribute changes in Etruscan cities to Greek colonists bringing new technologies and practices. Recent scholarship has rightly, I think, abandoned the idea of Greek-inspired cities, first through a whole-scale reassessment of Greek colonization, it's been referred to already, and more specifically as insufficient to explain longer-term urbanization processes, which I've described. The thesis still lingers. There's been a recent attempt to ascribe Cuniculi in South Etruria to the rise of Greek-style tyrants in the region. I'd still emphasize local and community-based perspectives for several reasons. First, while we do hear how Greek and Greek-style tyrants coerced urban populations to build waterworks, our ancient sources are heavily influenced by later Aristotelian concepts of tyranny, whose applicability to the early period and to Italy is rightly questionable. Second, the infrastructure we find north of the Tiber does not, in fact, look like what we see in Magna Graecia, or even Rome itself, where the grand archaic Cloaca Maxima held very close structural affinities with the grand sewer of Cumae. In Etruria, hydraulic technologies appear diverse site to site. They often are connected to contingent topographical features. So, for example, I've referred to the urban systems of Orvieto and Orte. These are highly complex systems. They resemble each other, but they also relate to similar dispositions of settlement, both on top of steep, tough plateaus. This point may be extended to emphasize contingency of hydraulic practices across Etruria. Take, for example, those cuniculi that I've shown. They're found very frequently in the south, but not all in the north. However, in the north, the underlying geology is quite different. You have coastal sandstones in particular that don't trap as much water underground as compared to the volcanic tuffs and limestone of South Etruria, which is more easily channeled. Undoubtedly, communities were developing strategies based upon local issues and local knowledge. If we frame resource management in early urban Etruria, then in terms of community-based agency, where would that lead? Well, I think if we boil down what I'm largely describing, here, we're largely talking about scale. Etruria develops resilient strategies that appear disintegrated but contingent, and are successful at supporting urban development, while sometimes also resembling an aggregation of household practices. That's certainly what we may be seeing with food storage. We can explore this further along both theoretical and empirical lines. First, resilience theory focuses on how societies adapt to external stressors, like environmental variability, in two ways. They can either invest capital, or they can build connectivity with systems beyond their own. I've been describing a system in Etruria that largely remained at the community level. It was successful in the sense that it allowed for complex urban society to develop, but nonetheless it remained highly contingent. What I've described, in essence, is a situation of comparatively low capital investment and, relative to later periods, low connectivity, something resilience theory would associate with poverty traps, situations in which dynamic systems are kept in a relatively low state of development by factors often inherited or external to the system. In Etruria, I've argued that urban strategies in the early period retained much of their community-level agency in the 6th century, in part because of that earlier legacy, because they emerged possibly when climate was favoring lower levels of investment. When conditions deteriorated, there was some attempt to accommodate a new reality, but only to an extent. The apparent absence of change in food storage practices is, I think, an illustration of this. Without a return to previous climate conditions, productive margins were bound to remain small and unpredictable. At least in the early period, we don't see strategies extending beyond the community level. Etruria, as far as we can see it, remained very much multifocal, and only later do we see famous signs of inter-city cooperation. There's, of course, a lot of evidence for this, but it's all later. I'm giving some examples here. The Alogia from Tarquinia, the famous Cipo dei Tirreni from Delphi, and Fanum Voltumnae, the federal sanctuary outside of Orvieto. But all of these things are from a later period. Without diverging too far into the topic of later Etruscan history, I want to conclude by trying to connect what I've been describing with what comes afterwards. My argument has been that the climate background of early urbanization supported contingent, but often smaller scale resilience strategies at the community level. These helped to a point, but may in turn have ultimately contributed to the considerable fragmentation of Etruria's urban society starting in the 6th century. A few decades ago, it was common to speak of Etruscan urban society in crisis by the later 6th century. Rupture is certainly legible, and new burial practices, increased signs of inter-community violence, complete abandonment of some sites. Recent research emphasizes multilinearity. Cities begin in this later period to follow discrete trajectories, and I think this fits very well with what I've been describing. When adaptations are only so extensive, an increasingly unpredictable climate will produce winners as well as losers, but stochastically, right, in unpredictable ways. So, for example, in the midst of a period of decline, we find our largest Etruscan wreck, the Grand Ribot F wreck, which had almost 1,000 kyrites and amphorae, right? Was this the result of an unexpectedly good harvest? But this must have been a sort of here today, gone tomorrow type of scenario. We see no durable consolidation of Etruscan urban society before the rise of Rome in the 4th and 3rd century. This need not imply some sort of failure on the part of Etruscan society, but it remains interesting to compare this discontinuity and multilinearity with the Roman expansion that followed. The Roman Republican state, of course, invested in urban resilience at imperial scales. Capitals, aqueducts, Grand Herrea built in mid-Republican colonies. I go beyond my topic here in closing, but I hope what this coda does is it reinforces the importance of ecology and climate to long-running settlement dynamics in early Italy. Thank you.